September 30th, 1955. A stretch of California highway just outside the tiny town of Cholame. A silver Porsche is headed north through the afternoon light. The driver is 24 years old. He's already a star, though he barely knows the full weight of it yet. Only one of his films has been released. 2 more are still sitting in editing rooms, waiting. At 5:45 in the evening, a Ford Tudor sedan turns left at the intersection. The driver of the Ford never sees the Porsche coming. What ended on that road that afternoon, and what it left behind, is still being felt 70 years later. This is the tragic story of James Dean, the boy from Indiana. Before there was a rebel, before there was the red jacket and the brooding stare, there was a small boy in Marion, Indiana, sitting beside his mother while she read poetry to him. James Byron Dean was born on February 8, 1931, in Marion, Indiana. He was the only child of Winton Dean, a dental technician, and Mildred Wilson Dean, a woman with a gift for art and performance and a particular devotion to her son that those who knew them said was unlike anything they had seen in a family. From the very beginning, Mildred recognized something in her boy. She enrolled him in dance lessons at 3 years old. She taught him violin. She made a puppet stage at home where the two of them would act out stories together, and she spent hours reading to him. Not children's books, but poetry, long passages of it, delivered in a way that let the words land on a young mind that was still deciding what kind of person it was going to be. When Jimmy was 5, the family moved to Santa Monica, California, following Winton's work for the Veterans Administration. Jimmy attended Brentwood Public School, then McKinley Elementary. California was a long way from Indiana in every direction, and the family was settled enough that it seemed they might stay there permanently. Jimmy was growing up in the sun, in the warmth of a mother who devoted enormous energy to cultivating whatever was taking shape in him. Then, in 1938, Mildred began to lose weight rapidly. She developed sharp abdominal pain that refused to resolve. By 1940, she was dead. Uterine cancer. She was 29 years old. Jimmy was 9. He later wrote about his mother's death in a high school essay as one of the defining moments of his life, describing how she passed out of his world and how the reason for it preyed on his mind for years. The loss was not just the grief of a child losing a parent. It was the severing of the one relationship that had made him feel understood. He and Mildred had shared a world together. Music, poetry, movement, imagination. She had spent hours reading to him, had built a puppet stage where they could create stories, had sat with him through violin practice with a patience that suggested she understood what it meant to take art seriously. When she was gone, that world closed, and Jimmy was left in the care of a father who had no framework for what his son needed next. Winton Dean was not built to manage the aftermath alone. He was a practical, reserved man who struggled with the emotional needs of a grieving 9-year-old in ways that left both of them increasingly remote from each other. His solution was logistical. He contacted his sister Hortense and her husband Marcus Winslow, who lived on a farm outside the small Quaker town of Fairmount, Indiana. He put Jimmy on a train. The boy traveled back to Indiana with his mother's casket in the freight car behind him. He would not live with his father again until he was nearly grown. Fairmount and the making of something. Fairmount, Indiana, was about as far from Santa Monica as a place could be in spirit and character. It was a Quaker farming community, modest, orderly, defined by work and faith and an ethic of plain living that asked nothing dramatic of anyone. For a boy carrying the particular grief of losing his mother, it was both a refuge and a constraint. Marcus and Hortense Winslow were warm, decent people who gave Jimmy a stable home and genuine affection. Hortense in particular took on a maternal role with an earnestness that Jimmy recognized and was grateful for, even as he understood it could never replicate what he had lost. Marcus bought him a Whizzer motorbike, a small motorized bicycle, when Jimmy was around 10, and the boy was on it constantly, tearing across the farm fields and the back roads around Fairmount with a speed and pleasure that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Marcus and Hortense gave him something specific. He was cared for, consistently, without condition. The farm was a working one: oats, livestock, the daily rhythms of agricultural life. And Jimmy participated in it with enough commitment that he was useful. He hunted rats in the barn. He had rabbits that he raised himself. He had a pony for his 10th birthday and spent considerable time on it. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him during those years in Fairmount, a normal Indiana farm boy when the situation called for it, and a boy who could be intensely interior at other times, without warning. He had an art teacher at Fairmount High School named Adeline Knoll, universally called Knoll, who became one of the most important adults in his adolescence. She recognized in Jimmy a quality of emotional expressiveness that the rest of his life didn't fully accommodate. She pushed him toward drama and public speaking. He competed in the Indiana High School Forensic Association, where he won multiple awards. He acted in school productions with a commitment that startled people who expected a farm kid to be self-conscious on stage. One year, he performed a dramatic reading from Charles Dickens that drew a standing ovation in a competition he subsequently won. He wasn't performing in the way that children perform when they want attention. He was using it for something deeper. He was also a serious athlete. He played varsity basketball, remarkable given that he stood 5'8" in a sport that rewarded height, and baseball, and was named Fairmount High's top athlete of his graduating year. The combination of artistic intensity and physical competition was unusual and spoke to something in him that needed full expression from multiple directions simultaneously, a restlessness that Fairmount could partially contain, but not entirely resolve. During these years, a local minister named Reverend James DeWeird became an influential figure in Jimmy's life. DeWeird was colourful and unconventional by Fairmount standards. He had served in World War II, had connections to the entertainment world, and shared with Jimmy an enthusiasm for car racing and theatre that set both of them apart from the farming community around them. He took Jimmy to races at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He introduced him to ideas and people and possibilities that the Quaker town didn't otherwise offer. The relationship was significant, and it was later the source of one of the most serious claims in James Dean's biography. According to what Dean himself reportedly confided to Elizabeth Taylor during the filming of Giant, something had happened between him and DeWeird in those years that he carried as a wound. A minister who had crossed a line with a boy in his care who trusted him. Dean spoke about it to Taylor as a confidence, not a public statement, and the nature of what was said was reported by a friend of Taylor's decades later. It has never been independently confirmed, but it was consistent with the particular quality of guardedness that people who knew Dean well described. The way he held people close and simultaneously kept parts of himself permanently sealed. He graduated from Fairmount High School in May 1949, receiving top awards in both art and drama. At 18, he was already certain about the direction he wanted to go. He moved to California, New York, and the method. He moved back to California in 1949 to live with his father, Winton, and Winton's new wife, Ethel, in Santa Monica. The relationship between father and son had been distant since Winton had sent 9-year-old Jimmy to Indiana after Mildred's death, and the reunion in adulthood was not easy. Winton was proud of his son in the careful, reserved way of a man who didn't demonstrate affection demonstratively, but he didn't understand the direction Jimmy had chosen. When Jimmy transferred his major at Santa Monica City College from pre-law to theater arts, Winton took it as a provocation rather than a declaration. Jimmy was admitted to UCLA and pursued theater there with the intensity of someone who had been waiting years for legitimate permission to do the thing that had always mattered most. He studied under James Whitmore, a working actor and teacher who recognized immediately that what Jimmy was doing went well beyond the ability of most drama students. The advice Whitmore gave him was direct. Go to New York. The actors' studio was there. Marlon Brando was there. Montgomery Clift was there. The most serious acting training in America was there. California had weather and film sets, but not the kind of rigorous craft environment that someone like Jimmy needed. In 1951, Jimmy Dean dropped out of UCLA and moved to New York. He was 19 years old. The New York years were lean and formative in roughly equal measure. He worked as a busboy in the theater district, scraping together enough to eat and pay rent while pursuing auditions and attending whatever readings and workshops he could find. He appeared in television productions. The early 1950s were a significant moment for live television drama in America, and the medium needed actors who could hold concentration and nerve during a broadcast with no second takes, and began accumulating a professional record that was modest but consistent. He was admitted to the Actors Studio, the most prestigious acting institution in America, where Lee Strasberg taught the technique known as method acting, a deeply interior approach to performance that required actors to draw on their own emotional memories and genuine psychological states rather than technical execution. The Actors Studio had already produced Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift, the two American actors of the era who were defining a new kind of masculine vulnerability on screen. Jimmy worshipped both of them with an intensity that his teachers found alternately impressive and difficult to redirect. He attended Brando's performances. He studied the specific physical choices, the pauses, the flinches, the way a moment of internal life could be communicated without language. He was, in the most committed sense, a student. The method suited something in him perfectly. It required exactly the kind of emotional access that most young men of his era were taught to suppress. The openness to pain, to grief, to longing, to the memory of loss. Jimmy had those things in abundance. He had been carrying them since he was 9 years old on a train back to Indiana. The method gave him a technical and philosophical framework for what he had always been doing instinctively. In 1952, he made his Broadway debut in a short-lived play called See the Jaguar. The production ran only 5 performances, but it put his name in front of the New York theater community. Small television roles continued to accumulate. Then, in 1954, he was cast in a Broadway production called The Immoralist, adapted from the novel by André Gide. He played a young North African houseboy, a small but scene-stealing role that he performed with a coiled, unpredictable energy that made the rest of the production feel slightly static by comparison. Elia Kazan came to see The Immoralist. He was casting a film adaptation of John Steinbeck's East of Eden, and had told his screenwriter he was looking for someone with the quality of a young Brando, moody, internally turbulent, capable of making an audience feel that what was happening on screen was genuinely happening rather than being constructed. He sat in the theater, watched Jimmy Dean play the houseboy, and made his decision. Dean left The Immoralist after only a few performances and followed Kazan west. East of Eden and the Arrival of a Star. The role Elia Kazan had in mind for James Dean was Cal Trask. the darker twin in Steinbeck's story of two brothers competing for the love and approval of a pious, cold father. Cal is the son who can't get it right, who tries everything available to him and is still turned away, who carries the awareness of his own failings with a rawness that is more honest than his brother's surface goodness. He is a character soaked in the particular grief of wanting something from a parent and being unable to obtain it no matter what he does. This was not a stretch for James Dean. It was the story he had been living since he was 9 years old. Kazan's production approach was notable for how deliberately he exploited the parallels between Dean's biography and Cal's situation. He had Dean use his own feelings about his absent father, about Mildred's death, about the years of emotional distance and unfulfilled longing, as direct fuel for the performance. Dean was known to arrive on set in a state of genuine emotional agitation on the days when the most demanding scenes were scheduled. His fellow actors found him difficult. He improvised where he was supposed to follow blocking. He was unpredictable in ways that made technical coordination almost impossible. He operated with an internal tempo that didn't match what the other performers were doing. Raymond Massey, who played the disapproving father Adam Trask, had a genuine friction with Dean that Kazan recognized as useful and refused to resolve. The most famous moment in the film was improvised entirely. In the scene where Cal presents his father with the money he has earned, an act of love and apology that Adam rejects. The script called for Dean to walk away. Instead, he turned back, crossed the room, and threw himself against the older man in an anguished embrace. Massey, unprepared, showed genuine shock. Kazan kept both takes, the impulse and the reaction. In the final cut, Dean watched the rough cut of East of Eden alongside director Nicholas Ray, who was there because Kazan thought he might be useful to him. Ray was casting a film called Rebel Without a Cause and needed someone for the lead. He sat in the dark and watched Dean's performance. Then he turned around and looked at Dean himself, sitting in the same room, shy, withdrawn, hunched over, and couldn't reconcile the two. The man on screen was enormous. The man in the chair was barely present. East of Eden premiered on March 9th, 1955. The reviews were, in many cases, unlike anything Hollywood had produced about a newcomer. One critic described Dean as giving the most vivid male performance in years. Gossip columnist Hedda Hopper wrote that his performance had already sent ripples through the industry before the general release. The public response was immediate and intense, in a way that surprised everyone, including Warner Brothers, which had not anticipated the scale of what was happening. He received a posthumous Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. He was, quite suddenly, the most talked-about young actor in Hollywood. He was also 23 years old, had made one major film, and was already being compared to Marlon Brando in a way that generated as much resentment as admiration. Rebel Without a Cause and the moment, the generation, found its voice. Nicholas Ray's film had started as a B-movie, a minor Warner Brothers project about juvenile delinquency that was expected to be a quick, cheap production aimed at the youth market. When the success of East of Eden became clear before the film's general release, Warner Brothers promoted Rebel Without a Cause to A-movie status and put it in color. The story followed Jim Stark, a new kid in town from a wealthy family, navigating the social cruelties of high school life, an emotionally cowardly father, and a culture that had no language for what was happening inside young people. Jim Stark's problem was not poverty or crime or social exclusion. His problem was the absence of a father who could stand up for something, who could model what it meant to face difficulty with courage and dignity. His father, played by Jim Backus, is a gentle, appeasing man who diffuses conflict by dissolving it, who dresses up in an apron to bring his wife a snack, and then cannot understand why his son looks at him with a particular kind of despair. Jimmy Dean played the despair. On the set of Rebel Without a Cause, Dean worked alongside Natalie Wood and Sal Mineo, both of whom were young and responsive to the particular atmosphere he generated. Wood later described working with him as unlike any acting experience she had before or after. She said there was a quality to what he did that made her forget she was performing. Mineo, who played a lonely teenager with a barely concealed devotion to Jim Stark, brought a vulnerability to his role that mirrored something in Dean's own. Dean built the Jim Stark performance around the film's central tension. A young man who desperately wanted his father to be different and who was furious at the man his father had become, even while loving him. The famous scene in the police station, where Jim tries to explain to his father why he has to go back to the boys who are threatening him, where he grabs his father by the lapels in a moment of frustrated love and sheer need, was one of the most electrically honest pieces of acting anyone in Hollywood had seen a young man deliver. Rebel Without a Cause opened on October 27th, 1955, less than a month after James Dean's death. By that point, the young man who had made it was already buried in Indiana. The film became one of the defining cultural documents of its era. The combination of Dean's death and the film's themes created a feedback loop that intensified the response to both. Young people watching Jim Stark struggle with fathers who didn't understand them, watching him reach for connection and find only distance, were watching it knowing that the man who had given that performance was gone. The grief and the identification became inseparable. Giant and the final days. While Rebel Without a Cause was still in production, Dean had already signed on for a third film. Giant was directed by George Stevens and based on Edna Ferber's novel about the transformation of Texas over several decades. Oil, cattle, race, money, and the human cost of ambition. The film starred Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor as the central couple, and Dean as Jet Rink, a ranch hand of bitter pride who eventually strikes oil and becomes one of the richest men in Texas without ever becoming at peace with himself. The Giant production took place in Marfa, Texas, during the summer of 1955, and it was characterized by a friction between Dean and director George Stevens that was considerably more severe than anything he had encountered with Kazan. Stevens was a deliberate, methodical director who valued control and precision. Dean was none of those things. He arrived late. He improvised when Stevens hadn't sanctioned it. He pushed back against direction in ways that the director found maddening. The relationship between them was difficult throughout. The relationship between Dean and his two co-stars was something different. Rock Hudson found him nearly impossible to work with on a technical level. The unpredictability, the changing timing, the tendency to do something different in every take. But he also acknowledged, years later, that Dean was doing something on screen that he himself couldn't access. Elizabeth Taylor responded to Dean differently. She found in him a genuine warmth and a vulnerability that the difficult exterior was partly protecting, and the two of them developed a real closeness during the months in Texas. According to William Bast, a close friend of Dean's, Taylor became someone he genuinely trusted, and it was to her, between takes on Giant, that he reportedly spoke about what had happened with the minister in Fairmount. His performance as Jet Rink, particularly in the film's final section, where an older, embittered, drunken Jet attempts to make a speech at a banquet and cannot hold himself together, was considered by many who saw the dailies to be among the finest work Dean had done. He aged himself decades in gesture, voice, and physical bearing, with a commitment that required him to find something inside the character that age and failure and unsatisfied hunger produce. Stevens himself, despite all the friction, acknowledged it. Dean finished his work on Giant in late September 1955, and the film itself would not be released until November 1956, more than a year after his death. He had been racing cars on weekends between productions, drawn to speed in the way he had been since Marcus Winslow put him on that whizzer motorbike on the Indiana farm. He had owned a series of sports cars in Hollywood, 4 in 18 months, each one faster and more serious than the last. On September 21st, 1955, while finishing the final days on Giant, he traded in his Porsche 356 Speedster at Competition Motors for a brand new 1955 Porsche 550 Spider, a purpose-built racing car that bore almost no resemblance to a street vehicle. He entered the Salinas Road Race, scheduled for October 1st and 2nd. He had the car painted with his racing number, 130, and had the words, "Little Bastard," lettered on the hood. The nickname had a story attached to it. Jack L. Warner, the head of Warner Brothers, had at some point referred to Dean as a little bastard during a dispute over a trailer on the East of Eden lot. Dean had not forgotten it, and naming the car was his version of claiming the insult and wearing it. He also, in the last week of September 1955, filmed a short public service announcement about road safety for an American television campaign. In it, he spoke directly to camera, urging viewers to be careful when they drove. He mentioned, specifically, that racing on open roads was not something he did himself. He kept it on the track. The PSA aired after his death. On September 30th, 1955, Dean and his mechanic, Rolf Wutherich, loaded the little bastard onto a trailer attached to a Ford Country Squire station wagon and set off for Salinas. Then, at the last minute, Dean decided to drive the Porsche to the race rather than trail it. He wanted to put miles on the engine and loosen it up before racing. Wutherich rode as passenger. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, a California Highway Patrol officer stopped Dean for speeding near Bakersfield. He received a ticket and continued north. By 4:45, he and Wutherich had stopped at a diner near Blackwell's Corner for a Coke and a brief rest. Other drivers from the same racing party were there, including Dean's friend Bill Hickman and photographer Sanford Roth. Then they pulled back onto the highway. The sky was beginning to change in that particular late-afternoon California way, the light turning golden and flat and slightly blinding when it came in from the west at the right angle. The intersection at Cholame. At approximately 5:45 in the afternoon, the little bastard was approaching the intersection of 2 state highways at the edge of a valley just outside the settlement of Cholame in San Luis Obispo County. The roads were open and dry. The traffic was sparse. A 1950 Ford Tudor sedan was heading east on Highway 466. The driver was a 23-year-old student named Donald Turnipseed from Tulare, California, enrolled at California Polytechnic State University. As he reached the intersection, he began to make a left turn onto Highway 41. Dean saw the Ford. According to Wutherich's later account, given to investigators and journalists in the years after the crash, before Wutherich's own tragic death in a separate car accident in Germany in 1981, Dean made some comment about the Ford stopping. It didn't stop. Turnipseed had simply not seen the low-profile silver Porsche coming. The afternoon light from the west was directly in his eyes. The two vehicles collided nearly head-on. The impact destroyed the Porsche. Wutherich was thrown from the car and landed in a ditch 30 feet from the wreckage. He had broken bones and suffered serious injuries, but survived. Turnipseed, in the larger, heavier Ford, was shaken and slightly injured, but walked away from the scene. Dean was still in the Porsche. Witnesses and police officers, who arrived within minutes, found Dean trapped in the wreckage. He was extracted from the car and transported to Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital, roughly 30 miles away. At approximately 6:20 in the evening on September 30th, 1955, James Byron Dean was pronounced dead at Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. He was 24 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a broken neck. The inquest, held on October 11th in San Luis Obispo, heard testimony from the California Highway Patrol, from witnesses at the scene, and from Donald Turnipseed himself, who said he had not seen the Porsche before beginning his turn. Witnesses confirmed that Dean had not been speeding at the moment of impact, despite the earlier ticket. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of accidental death. Turnipseed was found to have committed no criminal act. He gave one interview to a local newspaper immediately after the crash, and then, for the rest of his long life, he refused to speak publicly about it. He ran a successful electrical contracting business in Tulare for decades. He died in 1995, 40 years after the accident. News of Dean's death reached Hollywood and spread to the rest of the world within hours. At the time, only East of Eden had been released. Rebel Without a Cause was still in post-production and would open on October 27th, less than 4 weeks after the crash. Giant was still being edited and would not be released until November 1956. The world learned who James Dean was by watching his films after he was already gone. The legend that wouldn't stop. James Dean was buried in Park Cemetery in Fairmount, Indiana, on October 8, 1955, 8 days after the crash. 3,000 people attended the service. They came from across Indiana and from Hollywood, and they lined the roads into Fairmount in a way the town had never experienced and would not experience again. Marcus and Hortense Winslow, who had raised him, were there. His father Winton was there. The Fairmount community that had watched him grow up, that remembered the motorbike on the back roads and the drama performances in Adeline Knoll's classroom, stood around the grave of a young man who had left their town 6 years earlier and become one of the most recognizable faces in the world in the years since. He was buried wearing a pair of blue jeans. In the weeks and months that followed, Warner Brothers received a volume of mail that was unprecedented in the studio's experience. Letters from young people across America and Europe and Japan, many of them written with a grief and a personal intensity that suggested these young people were not simply mourning a movie star. They were mourning something that had spoken directly to them about their own lives. Jim Stark's inarticulate longing for a father who would be strong enough to face things. Cal Trask's love rejected despite everything he tried. Jet Rink's bitterness at a world that never gave him what he was reaching for. These were not characters on a screen. They were mirrors. The fan response had a quality that studios rarely encountered. Some letters arrived addressed to Dean personally, from people who wrote as if he were still alive and might answer. Others came from teenagers who described watching East of Eden or Rebel Without a Cause, and feeling, for the first time, that someone on screen understood what it was like to be them. Some of the letters described personal situations, difficult parents, loneliness, the feeling of being unreachable to the people who were supposed to be closest, that Dean himself would have recognized completely. The Academy Award nominations came in 1956. He was nominated posthumously for Best Actor for both East of Eden and Giant, the first and only actor ever nominated posthumously in the same ceremony. He did not win either award, but the dual nominations were themselves a statement about the scale of what had been lost. Rumors circulated almost immediately, with a persistence that studios find impossible to entirely extinguish, that Dean had not actually died, that he was alive, badly injured, living somewhere away from the public eye. These rumors continued for years and were never true. Their persistence was a measure of something genuine. People were not ready for him to be gone. He had only just arrived. His car, the little bastard, developed its own mythology in the years after the crash. After the wreck was towed to a garage in Cholame, the salvageable parts were sold off. A physician purchased the engine and installed it in his racing car. Another driver bought the transmission. A garage bought the tyres. In the subsequent months and years, the engine was said to have been involved in another fatal crash. The transmission in a crash that severely injured its driver, and the tyres, reportedly, both failed simultaneously on a car that rolled. A truck carrying the chassis to a highway safety exhibition skidded off the road. The driver died. The chassis of the little bastard vanished and has never been recovered. Whether the car was genuinely cursed is not something evidence can settle. What can be said is that the story of the curse grew with each new incident and became as much a part of the James Dean mythology as the films themselves. His grave in Fairmount became a place of pilgrimage that has not diminished in 70 years. The original headstone has been replaced multiple times because fans chipped pieces from it as mementos. The town holds an annual James Dean Festival in September. Every year, people come from Japan and France and Brazil and all across America, and they stand at the grave and feel whatever they feel. Something about him travels well across cultures and generations and decades. The grief, the longing, the beauty of someone who left too soon. It does not seem to go stale. What he left behind. By any conventional measure, James Dean's career was extraordinarily brief. He made 3 major films, all within 18 months. He completed only one of them, East of Eden, before his death. He was 24 years old. He had been a working Hollywood actor for less than 2 years when the little bastard collided with Donald Turnipseed's Ford at the intersection outside Cholame. And yet, the conversation about him has never stopped. Part of what keeps it alive is the films themselves, which remain among the most emotionally direct performances in American cinema. The work he did in those 18 months, the improvised embrace in East of Eden, Jim Stark's shaking anger in the police station in Rebel Without a Cause, the aging, drinking disintegration of Jet Rink in Giant. These performances do not feel like the work of someone who was there briefly and by accident. They feel like the work of someone who had an entire career's worth of emotional preparation packed into 3 films, because the preparation had been going on since childhood and there was no other place to put it. Part of what keeps the conversation alive is also the timing. He arrived at the exact moment when American youth culture was beginning to find its own self-consciousness. The awareness that the generation coming up in the 1950s was experiencing the world in ways their parents had no language for. He gave that feeling a face and a body and a voice. Jim Stark, in the red jacket with the collar turned up. Cal Trask, reaching for a father who can't accept what's being offered. These images travelled further and lasted longer than anyone at Warner Brothers could have anticipated in 1955, and the reason they lasted is that they expressed something about a specific kind of longing for parents who could receive love, for authority that was worth respecting, for connection that didn't require you to disappear in order to obtain it. That has not become less relevant with time. The comparison to Marlon Brando, which surrounded Dean's entire brief career, eventually gave way to a more specific recognition. Brando had a physical authority and a kind of hardness that kept certain vulnerabilities at a distance. Dean had no such distance. What he put on screen was the longing itself, raw, unguarded, without armor. The boy on the train back to Indiana with his mother's casket in the freight car. The kid who had spent his most formative years reading poetry in a room that no longer existed. He brought all of it with him every time he walked onto a set. and it showed in every performance in a way that no amount of technical instruction could have produced or replaced. Rock Hudson, who had found Dean nearly impossible to coordinate with on the set of Giant, said publicly after Dean's death that he had never worked with anyone who did what Dean did. Elizabeth Taylor, who had sat with him in the Texas heat and listened to things he trusted her with, said the loss was irreplaceable in a way she found difficult to articulate. Director Nicholas Ray said he had never found anyone else with what he had seen in Dean, and he spent years afterward looking. The relationship between James Dean's brief life and the enduring weight of his legend is not easy to explain by any single factor. But somewhere near the center of it is this. He was genuinely young when he made those films. Not young in the sense of inexperienced, but young in the sense of still bearing everything that had happened to him with full transparency. He hadn't yet learned to manage himself for long-term survival. He hadn't yet acquired the armor. And what that meant for the work was that it has a quality that most accomplished actors reach only in glimpses, and that he, through some combination of the life he had lived and the art he had chosen, sustained across 3 complete performances. He burned very fast, and what he left is still burning. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. She was baptized on a private Greek island and inherited a fortune estimated in the billions before she was old enough for kindergarten. She is the last surviving descendant of one of the most famous dynasties in the 20th century, and she has spent most of her life trying to disappear. What lies behind that impulse, what it actually looks like to be born into that name, that money, and that history, is one of the strangest and saddest stories in modern wealth. This is the life of Athena Onassis. The dynasty she was born into. To understand Athena's life, you have to understand the family she was born into. Because the Onassis story is not simply a story about wealth. It is a story about wealth shadowed, consistently, by loss. Aristotle's Socrates. Onassis was born in 1906 in Smyrna, in what is now Turkey, into a modest Greek merchant family. He had almost nothing when he arrived in Buenos Aires as a young man with around $60 in his pocket and a willingness to work at any hour. By his mid-30s, he had built a shipping empire of startling scale. Oil tankers, freighters, a private airline called Olympic Airways, a 325-foot yacht named Christina after his daughter, private islands in the Ionian Sea. He collected properties and partnerships and powerful friendships with a combination of instinct and aggression that became the defining story of post-war Greek ambition. He was flamboyant, ruthless, charming, and enormously conscious of his own legend. He was also, by many accounts, a difficult father, physically absent for much of his children's early years, emotionally demanding when present, and constitutionally unable to prioritize his family over the next deal. He had 2 children with his first wife, the Greek shipping heiress Tina Livanos, whom he married in 1946. Tina was 17 at the time of their wedding, and Aristotle was 40. The first child was Alexander, born in 1948. The second was Christina, born in 1950. Both children grew up on his terms, shuttled between villas, yachts, and apartments across multiple continents, surrounded by staff, educated by private tutors, and largely deprived of the one thing ordinary children take for granted: a predictable and stable home life. Christian Dior designed the clothes worn by Christina's doll when she was a girl. Saudi royalty sent ponies as gifts. The family yacht was decorated with bar stools covered in the skin of a whale's foreskin. Wealth, in the Onassis world, was not merely a background condition. It was the atmosphere itself. Aristotle's marriage to Tina collapsed in 1960. undone by his very public affair with the Greek opera singer Maria Callas. The divorce left Alexander and Christina caught between two parents whose animosity toward each other was barely managed in private and not managed at all in public. Tina eventually married Aristotle's bitterest rival, the Greek shipping magnate Stavros Niarchos, a move so designed to wound that it transformed the already intense business competition between the two men into something deeply personal. For Alexander and Christina, it meant growing up with their mother's new husband being their father's sworn enemy. Then, in October 1968, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the 35th President of the United States. The wedding took place on Skorpios, his private island in the Ionian Sea. It was one of the most discussed society events of the decade. Both Alexander and Christina opposed the marriage, reportedly deeply unsettled by the idea of their father binding the family name to a woman they distrusted and whom they felt was marrying for the protection that wealth and power offered, rather than for any feeling. Alexander was quoted privately as saying that his father loved the names and Jackie loved the money, a description that was sharp and unkind, but not entirely without observable basis. The marriage would last until Aristotle's death 7 years later, but it was not a warm household by anyone's description. None of this could be described as a happy family. But the tragedies that followed in quick succession were of a different magnitude entirely. In January 1973, Alexander Onassis, 24 years old and recently appointed president of Olympic Aviation, his father's regional airline subsidiary, was participating in a test flight at Hellinikon International Airport in Athens. He was in the passenger seat while a potential new pilot, Donald McCusker, flew the aircraft, a Piaggio P-136 L2 amphibious plane. Shortly after takeoff, the plane crashed. The investigation concluded that the aileron cables had been incorrectly reversed during the installation of a new control column, creating a situation where the plane became uncontrollable almost immediately after leaving the ground. Aristotle was in New York when the news reached him. He collapsed. He was on a flight to Athens within hours. He brought in the best neurosurgeons he could reach from London and elsewhere. Alexander was in a coma. He never came out of it. He died on January 23, 1973, having never regained consciousness. He was 24 years old. The death of his son broke Aristotle Onassis in ways that were immediately visible to everyone around him. He had built his empire partly with the expectation that Alexander would inherit it. He had groomed him, argued with him, clashed with him over his choices and his manner and his romantic interests. And now Alexander was gone, and the empire had no heir it had been designed to accommodate. Aristotle became obsessed with the idea that the crash had been sabotage. He posted a reward of $1 million for information about who he believed had arranged his son's death. The reward has never been claimed. He developed myasthenia gravis, an autoimmune disorder that steadily weakened him. The man who had once dominated every room he entered was visibly diminishing. Those who knew him best said he had simply lost the will to live. Tina Onassis died in October 1974, less than 2 years after her son. The circumstances of her death remained uncomfortable in the public account. She was found dead in Paris, and the conclusion was that her heart had given out, though the years of stress and what was believed to be a dependence on sedatives had left her body far more fragile than her 45 years should have suggested. She left most of her estate to her daughter Christina. Aristotle Onassis died on March 15, 1975, at the American Hospital of Paris. He was 69 years old. Myasthenia gravis and respiratory failure were the stated causes. His friends, with various degrees of poetry, described it differently. The man had died of grief. Within a span of less than 30 months, the Onassis family had lost three of its central figures: Alexander at 24, Tina at 45, Aristotle at 69. What remained was Christina, alone, in possession of one of the largest private fortunes in the world, carrying everything that had been lost in the years since 1973. Christina, the mother who couldn't stay. Christina Onassis inherited 55% of her father's estate at his death in 1975, along with the responsibility of managing the Onassis shipping empire that had taken her father decades to build. She was 24 years old, had lost her brother 2 years before, her mother to a suspected overdose of sedatives the year after that, and her father to grief in 1975. Within 29 months, she had lost every member of her immediate family. She was the last one standing, and what she was standing in front of was one of the largest private fortunes in the world. She was not, by most accounts, built for what was required of her. Christina was intelligent and capable in ways that the press of the era consistently underestimated. She managed the shipping business with genuine competence in the years after Aristotle's death, overseeing a fleet and a network of commercial relationships that demanded real understanding of global trade and finance. But she was also deeply insecure, prone to depression, and possessed of an extraordinary vulnerability to people who promised her the connection and stability that her childhood had never reliably offered. She had been diagnosed with clinical depression in her late 20s and prescribed a combination of medications, barbiturates, amphetamines, and sleeping pills, to which she developed a serious dependency. She struggled with her weight in ways that were extensively and unkindly documented, going on crash diets and then abandoning them, losing significant weight, and then gaining it back when the depression reasserted itself. The press of the 1970s and 1980s treated her appearance as a subject of public commentary in ways that were both relentless and unkind, and Christina was not insulated enough from it to be unaffected. She married 4 times in 16 years. Her first husband, married in 1971 when she was 20, was Joseph Bolker, a Los Angeles real estate developer who was 27 years her senior and a divorced father of 4 daughters. Aristotle reportedly pressured her to end the marriage. It lasted 9 months. Her second husband was Alexander Andriadis, from a Greek shipping family, married in 1975, shortly after her father's death. It lasted 14 months. Her third husband was Sergei Kauzov, a Russian shipping agent, married in 1978. It lasted 1 year. Her fourth husband was Thierry Roussel, a French pharmaceutical heir, married in 1984. The marriage to Roussel was different from the others in one significant way. It produced a child. On January 29, 1985, at the American Hospital of Paris in Neuilly-sur-Seine, Christina Onassis gave birth to a daughter. She named her Athena, after her own mother, the grandmother the child would never know. The baptism was held on Skorpios, the island that had been the heart of the Onassis family world, and for a brief period it seemed as though the dynasty might have found a way to continue itself. Christina had discovered, before Athena was born, that Roussel had been conducting a parallel relationship with a Swedish model named Marianne Landhage, with whom he had already fathered 2 children during the marriage. The discovery was devastating. Roussel and Christina separated, and the divorce was finalized in 1987 when Athena was 2 years old. Christina was determined to raise her daughter personally. She had not been raised well herself. She had been handed to staff and moved between properties and given every material thing while the human presence in her life was inconsistent at best. She would not do that to Athena. She began to structure her life around her daughter with an energy and an attention that people close to her found genuinely moving. She took fewer trips. She cut back on the party circuit she had inhabited since her 20s. She said, by multiple accounts, that Athena was the first thing in her life that had made her feel that she understood what she was supposed to be doing. She had been searching for that feeling through 4 marriages and 20 years of social noise, and she had found it at 37 in a flat in Paris with a small child who needed her. She took Athena to Buenos Aires in November 1988 because a friend had invited her and she needed a change of environment. On November 19th, 1988, Christina Onassis was found dead by her housekeeper in the bathtub of a mansion in Tortuguitas, outside Buenos Aires, Argentina. She had been visiting friends. The autopsy found that she had died of a heart attack caused by acute pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs causing the heart to fail. She was 37 years old. There was no evidence of any intentional act. The years of severe crash dieting, the long dependency on various medications, and the simple cumulative toll of a life lived under enormous pressure had left her heart in a condition that could not sustain the demands placed upon it. She had gone to Buenos Aires to be somewhere different for a while. She had not told anyone she was unwell. A private Greek Orthodox funeral was held 3 days later on Scorpios, where she was buried in the Onassis family plot alongside her father and brother. The island now held 3 graves. Athena was 3 years old. She was, in a single morning, the last surviving member of the Onassis direct line, and she was too young to understand any of it. The richest little girl in the world. The press described Athena Onassis as the richest little girl in the world immediately after her mother's death. It was a phrase designed to make readers envious, and it said almost nothing useful about what the child's actual situation was. Christina had never fully trusted Thierry Roussel. She had watched him conduct an affair throughout their marriage, had seen him bring 2 children into the world with another woman while she was his wife, and had chosen nonetheless to have his child because she wanted a family and believed, perhaps against her better judgment, that he was the best she was likely to find. When she made her will, she arranged specifically for the Onassis fortune to be placed under the control of a board of Greek trustees, 4 men named Stelio Papadimitriou, Paul Ioannidis, Apostolos Zabelas, and Theodore Gabrielides, rather than leaving its management in the hands of Roussel. The message of that arrangement was clear enough. She did not trust the man she had married to manage what she was leaving behind. After Christina's death, Roussel took custody of Athena and moved with her to Switzerland, to a house in the village of Lucy-sur-Morge, near Lake Geneva. He was by this point also living with Marianne Landhage, the woman with whom he had conducted the affair that had ended his marriage. Landhage had 3 children with Roussel: Eric, born in July 1985, just months after Athena, Sandrine, born in May 1987, and Johanna, born later. Athena grew up in this household, raised by her father and his new partner, surrounded by half-siblings who were the living product of the affair that had ended her parents' marriage. Whatever one makes of the circumstances, Roussel did something that most people in his position, with access to the kind of money that Athena's inheritance represented, might not have done. He deliberately constructed a modest and ordinary domestic environment. He enrolled Athena in the local school in Lucy-sur-Morge, alongside other children from the village, none of whom were particularly interested in who her grandfather was. He kept her away from the press with a consistency that required active effort. Journalists and photographers who showed up in the area found that Roussel was serious about it. He kept her away from the social world that the Onassis name might have opened. He kept her in a farmhouse rather than a palace, surrounded by a reconstituted family rather than the jet-set crowd that had defined Christina's life. Whether this was motivated primarily by genuine concern for his daughter, or by the more practical calculation that the trustees were monitoring every expenditure he made, and that excess spending would draw consequences, or by some combination of both, the result was a childhood that bore almost no visible resemblance to the Onassis world that had come before. Every penny Roussel spent on Athena's behalf had to be approved by the board of Greek trustees. The trustees and Roussel were in a state of persistent tension throughout Athena's childhood and adolescence. Roussel repeatedly threatened to move the family to France, where tax arrangements would have been considerably more burdensome for the estate, and where his own authority over the inheritance might have been easier to assert. The trustees resisted. The dispute eventually went to court, and in 1999, a court in Vaduz, Liechtenstein, ordered the management of Athena's inheritance to be transferred to KPMG Fides, an auditing firm in Lucerne, Switzerland, which would administer it until Athena came of age on her 18th birthday. This was the world Athena grew up inside. A comfortable but modest Swiss family life as its external surface, and underneath it, a complex legal and financial architecture of disputed millions, competing interests, and lawyers representing every party except herself. She attended her local school. She did her homework. She had half-siblings at the dinner table who were the children of the affair that had ended her parents' marriage. She had a father who was fighting the Greek trustees in court and using the funds of her inheritance to do it. She was, by the time she was a teenager, fluent in French, English, Portuguese, and some Swedish. She had no Greek. She had no meaningful connection to the country her family name came from, no knowledge of the culture or the language, and no particular desire for either. When she was 13, in an interview conducted for legal proceedings, she expressed what was described as a great aversion to anything Greek. The Onassis name, which had defined her family's identity for decades, and which the world still associated with glamour and power, was to her, at 13, simply the source of all the problems. Becoming Athena. The few things that Thierry Roussel had given his daughter that worked, that genuinely took root in her and produced something lasting, were horses. He had enrolled her in riding lessons as a child, partly as a practical decision, and partly, perhaps, because the discipline and focus that equestrian training required was a useful counterweight to the unanchored quality of a childhood defined by legal disputes and the constant shadow of an extraordinary inheritance. Horses were a world unto themselves, demanding, physical, immediate, and completely indifferent to how much money the person on their back happened to be worth. They did not care about the Onassis name. They required presence, patience, and physical communication. Athena took to them with an intensity and a commitment that surprised even the people training her. By her mid-teens, she was competing seriously, and the world of show jumping, technically demanding, physically rigorous, conducted in a relatively private social sphere among people who shared the obsession, gave her something that almost nothing else in her life had offered. A place where who she was mattered more than whose granddaughter she happened to be. She finished second in an event in Jerez, Spain in 2001, at 16. It was her first notable competitive result, and it demonstrated that whatever the Onassis name brought to other aspects of her life, in the arena it was simply extra weight. She completed her education at an international school in Brussels in 2003, passing her baccalaureate that summer. She had been largely shielded from public attention throughout her adolescence, which was deliberate on Roussel's part. She had no social media presence, gave no interviews, attended no parties that the tabloid press could photograph, and was, in the most literal sense, a face that the world had almost never seen. The world's richest little girl, had grown up to be someone almost nobody could identify. On January 29, 2003, Athena Onassis turned 18. Under the terms of her mother's estate, she assumed control of her inheritance on that date. The assets included 217 bank accounts, stakes in 87 companies operating across 4 continents, an airline, hotel properties, and a fleet of 38 tankers. The island of Skorpios was still in the family holdings, along with its 3 graves. The fortune was estimated variously between $800 million and several billion, depending on the source and the methodology used to calculate the harder-to-value assets. Nobody outside the KPMG FIDES team and the trustees had a clear picture of the total. Athena, 18 years old and newly in possession of this labyrinthine empire, had never attended university. She had no business training. She spoke no Greek, had limited familiarity with the companies whose names were on the share certificates, and had spent her childhood in a farmhouse in Switzerland, rather than the offices and boardrooms where her grandfather had built what she was now inheriting. What she had, beyond the assets themselves, was a quality that Alexis Manthiakis, a family advisor who had known her since she was 13, would later describe with particular admiration. She had, he observed, something of her grandfather Aristotle in her. A stubbornness, a willingness to fight, a refusal to be managed entirely by the people around her who believed they knew better. That quality was about to be tested. The battle with her father. The first major confrontation of Athena's adult life was not with the trustees or the Greek business establishment. It was with her own father. Thierry Roussel had spent the decade of Athena's childhood and adolescence managing the tension between the trustees and his own financial interests, with a combination of legal threats and court challenges. He had, by various accounts, used Athena's inheritance money for expenditures that the board considered inappropriate. He had structured certain arrangements in ways that served his interests alongside hers. The relationship between Roussel and the trustees had been adversarial for years, and Roussel had become accustomed to a degree of financial authority over his daughter's affairs that he apparently expected to continue into her adulthood. When Athena began, in her late teens, to make independent decisions about her own life, including decisions about a man she had met at a riding school who was considerably older than her, Roussel attempted to reassert control. His lawyers filed legal challenges designed to tighten his authority over her inheritance. Athena's lawyers responded. What followed was a legal battle between a father and a daughter over the money that the daughter had been left by the mother that the father had not stayed faithful to. Athena won. The details of the settlement remained private, but the outcome was clear. She retained full control of her own affairs, and the relationship between Athena and her father, which had never been simple, given the specific circumstances of her childhood, cooled significantly in the years that followed. By the time she was in her mid-20s, people close to the situation described a relationship that was distant and occasionally tense. She had stood up to him in court and prevailed, and neither of them could entirely set that aside. The man she had been fighting her father over was Álvaro Afonso de Miranda Neto, a Brazilian professional showjumper known in the equestrian world by the nickname Doda. He was 12 years older than Athena, a 2-time Olympic medalist, and one of the most accomplished riders in the world. She had met him at the riding school of the legendary trainer Nelson Pessoa, and the relationship that developed between them was rooted in the shared language of horses, the one environment where Athena had always felt most fully herself. They had been together since March 2003. Athena moved to São Paulo to be with him, bought a duplex overlooking Ibirapuera Park for $8.5 million, and began building a life in Brazil. They married on December 3, 2005, in a ceremony in Sao Paulo that required significant security and attracted considerable press attention, though Athena herself remained characteristically composed through it. She was 20 years old. He was 32. She had known him for 2 years, and she had already, in the process of choosing him, fought her own father in court and won. The life she was trying to build. The marriage to Álvaro de Miranda Neto was, for much of its early years, the closest thing Athena had to the ordinary life she had been reaching for. They competed together in the show-jumping circuit, travelling to events across Europe, South America, and beyond, living inside the structured world of elite equestrian sport, in a way that gave both of them a shared purpose and a shared language. They co-owned a horse breeding and training business called AD Sport Horses, based in Belgium. In 2007, Athena established the Athena Onassis International Horse Show in Sao Paulo, a competition that would eventually move to Rio de Janeiro and then to the beaches of Saint-Tropez. In 2008, she began competing under the Greek flag, choosing to represent Greece rather than France at show-jumping events. She affiliated with the Avlona Riding Club in Athens and competed using the name Athena Onassis. Competing as a Greek citizen was not a trivial gesture for someone who had described, at 13, a great aversion to anything Greek. It was a deliberate step toward an identity that had been shaped by tragedy and distance rather than familiarity or choice. Whether it reflected a genuine shift in her relationship with her heritage, or was more of a practical athletic decision, the effect was visible. She had stopped running from the name. In 2009, she placed third in a CSI Grand Prix in Valencia, Spain. She was competing seriously, improving steadily, and the equestrian press treated her as a legitimate competitor rather than a wealthy curiosity. In 2010, she made a decision that received considerable public attention. She sold Scorpios, the private island where her mother, uncle, and grandfather were buried, where she had been baptized as an infant, where the family had gathered for its most significant moments over 3 decades. She sold it to trusts connected with Ekaterina Rybolovleva, daughter of a Russian fertilizer billionaire. The price was not publicly disclosed, but estimates varied widely into the hundreds of millions. Whether the sale was primarily a financial decision or also a way of closing a chapter on a history that had always been more weight than inheritance, Athena has never explained publicly. She sold it and moved on. In 2012, she suffered a serious spinal injury in a fall from a horse during competition. It was a significant injury that required lengthy recovery and threatened her career. She recovered. She competed at the 2013 European Show Jumping Championships. She went to the 2014 World Championships. The injury had interrupted, but not ended, what had become, by that point, the most consistent and self-directed thing in her adult life. Meanwhile, the fortune she had inherited at 18 was being reduced by a combination of factors. Poor investment decisions, the costs of a serious international equestrian operation, the expenses of maintaining properties across multiple countries, and the ongoing costs of various legal matters had drawn the estimates down significantly from the billions that had been described at her 18th birthday. By the mid-2000s, some financial reporters placed her actual net worth at somewhere in the range of $500 million. Still an extraordinary figure, but a fraction of what had been inherited. And then the marriage fell apart. Betrayal and the weight of the name. In 2016, Athena received information from a friend, or, as later reporting suggested, from a family advisor, that her husband had been conducting a parallel relationship with another woman for a period estimated at 8 years of their 11-year marriage. The woman in question was a Belgian model whose account of the relationship, when it eventually reached the press through the account of the advisor Alexis Manthiakis, described a sustained deception conducted throughout much of Athena's marriage. The timing of the revelation placed the beginning of the affair not long after their wedding. Athena filed for divorce in 2016. Álvaro de Miranda Neto initially pursued a substantial financial settlement, citing a prenuptial agreement that, if the divorce was filed by Athena, would have entitled him to alimony payments of €350,000 per month, as well as a one-time payment of €11 million, plus custody of horses the couple had purchased together. The prenuptial agreement, in other words, was structured in a way that presumed whatever ended, the marriage would be a mutual decision or initiated by him, not a consequence of infidelity on his part. Athena's legal team obtained the dossier that documented the nature and duration of his deception and presented it in court. The Belgian court, where the divorce proceedings took place, heard the arguments from both sides. Neither Athena nor Álvaro appeared personally. Their lawyers negotiated an agreement. He received substantially less than the prenuptial agreement would have entitled him to. The divorce was finalized in November 2017. At the end of it, Athena had lost 11 years of her life to a marriage that had been built, at least in part, on a deception that began almost immediately and continued until she was told about it by someone else. There is something in that specific trajectory, the discovery of betrayal coming not from the person who committed it, but from outside, arriving as reported information rather than acknowledged truth, that echoes, in its own muted way, the quality of the Onassis story at large. The worst things in this family have typically not announced themselves. They have been found, unexpectedly, in a bathtub in Buenos Aires, on a runway in Athens, in a hospital room in Paris. They arrive as facts after the fact. After the divorce, Athena moved to Greece, the country she had wanted nothing to do with at 13, the country her mother had loved and her grandfather had built his identity around, the country whose culture and language had always felt like someone else's inheritance. She arrived there, at 32 years old, without a husband and without children, and began living in a quieter way. What remains? She competes still, when her health and circumstances allow, under the Greek flag. She has been seen at horse shows in Athens, riding for the Avlona Riding Club. In 2019, she appeared at the Longinus FEY Jumping Nations Cup near Athens. A quiet, almost unannounced appearance that local press noted with surprise, given how thoroughly she had avoided Greece for most of her life. She arrived, she competed, she left. She said very little about it. She travels less than she used to. She has, by the accounts of people who encounter her at events, become a more guarded presence than she was during the São Paulo years. Quieter, more watchful, carrying the accumulated weight of a life that has given her almost nothing for free. She has no children. She has said nothing publicly to explain whether this reflects a deliberate choice or simply the way things have fallen. She has no close family that functions as family in the conventional sense. Her relationship with her father, Thierry Roussel, is described as strained and minimal. The court battle she won as a young woman over her own inheritance left a fracture in that relationship that years have not visibly healed. Her half-siblings, Eric, Sandrine, and Johanna, the children of the woman her father left her mother for, exist in a separate orbit. She makes rare public appearances and gives almost no interviews. When she is photographed at horse shows, she is usually focused on the course ahead, not the camera. She is the last of the Onassis direct line. When she dies, whatever happens next to the fortune and the name, the direct descent from Aristotle ends with her. There will be no more Onassis heirs. The dynasty that the press of the 1960s and 1970s treated as one of the permanent fixtures of the jet-set world will close. The Onassis Foundation, established in Alexander's memory after his death in 1973, remains one of the most significant cultural philanthropic institutions in Greece, funding scholarships, supporting the arts, building hospitals, operating an arts centre in Athens. After Athena turned 21 in 2006, her lawyers challenged the foundation's leadership to install her as its president, arguing that as the last Onassis heir, she should oversee the institution established in her family's name. The foundation's board declined. Their stated reason was specific and pointed. She had no connection with Greek culture, religion, or language. She had no university degree. She had no work experience in any relevant field. She was, in their assessment, unqualified for the role. The board's spokesman, Stelio Papadimitriou, offered what was perhaps the most honest summary of the situation anyone has produced. There was nothing they wanted more than to have a descendant of Onassis lead the foundation, but that Athena's qualifications for the position were simply not there, and the foundation's purpose demanded more than a surname. It is the peculiar trap her life has always represented. She was born into a name that carried enormous expectations, and then deliberately kept from the culture and education and experience that might have equipped her to meet them. Her father raised her in Switzerland, away from Greece, away from the Greek business world, away from the institutions and relationships that the Onassis name had always navigated. The result was a woman who is the last Onassis, in possession of the last portion of the Onassis fortune, and who is, by her own acknowledgement, disconnected from the culture that gave the name its meaning. She once told her stepmother, Marianne Landhage, in a conversation that Landhage later recounted on American television, that if she could burn all the Onassis money, she would do it. The money has been with her since she was 3 years old. It has been fought over, mismanaged, divided, spent, and reduced. It has brought her a legal battle with her own father, a marriage that was not what it appeared to be, and a public identity that she has consistently tried and consistently failed to escape. The name has followed her everywhere, regardless of whether she claimed it or tried to disclaim it. In a published interview with an Italian magazine, she said that she blamed all the problems on the Onassis name. She was not wrong. The name came with the inheritance of a story that began with a man who rose from nothing and accumulated everything and lost his son on a runway in Athens in January 1973 and was never the same after. It came with a mother who died in Buenos Aires at 37, found by a housekeeper in a bathtub, alone. It came with a grandfather who died of grief, and a grandmother who died under circumstances that were never fully comfortable. It came with an uncle who lived 24 years and was buried on an island that has now been sold to someone else. Athena did not choose any of this. She was born into it on January 29th, 1985, and baptized on Scorpios while her parents' marriage was already dissolving, and became the last surviving Onassis at 3 years old, with no one to ask what that meant. Whatever she has built since, the equestrian career, the competitions under the Greek flag, the quiet life in Greece after everything else, she has built it inside the constraints of a story that started before she was born, and that she has never had the power to rewrite. She is 40 years old. She is, as far as anyone knows, alone. She is the last one. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.